I'm just going to start and make a brief introduction to, before I pass it on to Randy, as to the how and why we put Learning to Glow together. I say we. John Bradley, the editor, and I started out together as co-editors, and then after the manuscript got, after we had gathered most of the manuscripts, and I stepped back to be contributing editor so he could do the final tuning and make the contract with the publisher and so on and so forth. So initially, John Bradley and I met through his putting together this excellent anthology of poetry called Atomic Ghost: Poets Respond to the Nuclear Age. And John had seen some of my work in various magazines, and also my collection, Black Ash Orange Fire, New and Collected Poems, which came out in 1986. And so he contacted me, and I ended up being a contributing editor to Atomic Ghost: Poets Respond to the Nuclear Age, as well as having 2 poems in there. In 1986, a professor, a friend of mine at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, Patricia Brodsky, had John and I out for a seminar on the nuclear age, and she did a follow-up by writing an article for Poets and Writers, which, if you want to look at it, see a picture of John Bradley. He sort of looks like Trotsky in this picture, except he's a very mild and modest person, is John. You might want to leaf through that. So after the seminar, we got to talking, and we thought, well, we put out an anthology of poetry. Let's put out an anthology of prose essays on the nuclear age, but not just essays on the nuclear age by anybody, since Atomic Ghost has poets from all over the world: Russia, Japan, Ireland, so on and so forth. But to do an anthology that concentrates on the American experience with our nuclear history, and thus Learning to Glow came into being. I met Randy Morris through a colleague and friend of ours who's also a counselor. And so when I met Randy, I said, well, you know, we're putting together this anthology of essays on the nuclear age, and he happened to have a book out called Encounters with Hiroshima, or it was about to come out, and so we selected one of his essays to be in the anthology. So I'm going to pass it on to Randy, and he's going to read and talk about his piece, and afterwards, when he finishes, if you have any questions you want to ask him, feel free to do so, and we'll do the same after I do my little bit. So take it away, Randy.
Okay, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this subject. It is a very difficult subject to approach, and it's frankly difficult to find audiences willing to listen to it. I'd like to preface a couple readings from my essay by making 2 points. One is that thinking about the nuclear issue and about Hiroshima and about nuclear war is always a kind of exercise in scale. I liken it to the image of that spaceship that comes into Close Encounters of a Third Kind, where all through the movie you're being lulled into sort of normal space and time, and then this spaceship sort of comes down and it's completely out of proportion in size to anything that you had been experiencing during the rest of the movie. It seems sort of completely other. And the same kinds of thing comes to us when we start talking about nuclear war. There was a great exercise done yesterday on KUOW radio that Bill and I were on by David Hall, the former president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, where he had a big, kind of stew pan and a big bunch of BBs. And so it was a great sort of auditory experience in which he took 3 BBs and said, this is the total power of all the armaments, including the 2 atomic bombs that were exploded in World War II. And he drops the 3 BBs into the pan. Ting, ting, ting. And then he takes 8 BBs and he says, this is the total firepower on 1 nuclear Trident submarine. 2.5 times everything that happened in World War II. And he puts those in. Ting, 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 ting. And then he has this mason jar sized bunch of BBs and says, this is the amount of firepower currently in the nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States. And it takes about 40 seconds for all the BBs to pour out of that jar into the bowl. So it's the kind of imagination that it's difficult to wrap ourselves around. Oh, you have the tape of that? Yeah, it's good. Maybe we can cue that up a little later. So it's always sort of a matter of us getting out of habitual ways of thinking when we take on this topic. And indeed, that point that we have to think in entirely new ways, to me, is the whole point of talking about Hiroshima. The one thing I try to avoid when talking about this subject is always the first question that comes at me when I'm being interviewed by people, and that is, should we have dropped the bomb or not? And my point in answer to that question is, I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't living in the intense political atmosphere. To me, that's not a generative question. It may be a useful question for dealing with guilt and historical this or that, but frankly, it's not an interesting question to me. And I also want to respect the people who had to make that decision, and frankly, I just sort of set it aside, saying that if we spend all of our time talking about that, which is what most newspapers were talking about in the 50th anniversary, it was all should we or shouldn't we have, then it obscures all these other incredibly complicated and much deeper questions. So when I start off like that talking about Hiroshima, it automatically puts me in a different kind of camp from the usual kind of rhetoric around Hiroshima. I tend to think, well, there's socio-political issues around that and in one side, and then on the other side are what I call psycho-spiritual issues that are suggested by the experience in Hiroshima and all of the nuclear stuff since. And frankly, that's where I go, into the psycho-spiritual. Which is why I make the small gesture of lighting a candle. I have an image of the Weeping Buddha up here. And I have to say that even when I try to write something about Hiroshima, it takes me days, even weeks, to sort of work myself up into it. And then I have to go through a series of meditations and then drop down into the experience. I get out the pictures of what the bomb did to the Japanese people. I get out stories and accounts of personal anecdotes, not mass numbers, but personal anecdotes of people's encounters with nuclear radiation or with their own experience in Hiroshima, and try to move through the power of the thinking heart into what I want to say about it. Now, the particular essay that's in this book that's on sale here, Learning to Glow, was actually written at the behest of the 50th anniversary. I guess, no, actually it was the 45th anniversary. I was asked by my friend Walter Enlow to write an essay, and I was trying to sort of work myself up to it because it's such a difficult topic to deal with. And did the meditations I just described, and then even then I couldn't quite find the time to do it, except there was this line of poetry going through my head. And the line of poetry said, "O Hiroshima, you cry out to my reluctant heart." And I couldn't get this line out of my head. And I go, okay, must mean I'm ready to write. And indeed, I was called to jury duty the next week. And any of you who've been on jury duty know there's a long period of time where you're doing absolutely nothing. So I pulled out my yellow pad and I wrote this essay while I was waiting to get on the jury. The poem in its entirety as it came out to prepare me for this writing this essay is as follows. And by the way, I'm reading from my book, Encounters with Hiroshima, but all of the readings are the essay that appears in Learning to Glow. I just do it out of this because I can find my place a little easier. So here's the poem that I hope will help us to take us down into this arena that we're going to be discussing here. O Hiroshima, you cry out to my reluctant heart. Must I enter your flaming Tory gate once more? Ride past lit lanterns floating on ink-dark seas, to gaze upon seared flesh and the skulls of the dead, water wells fouled by inhuman thirst? Must I suffer once more the indignity of my God's face bubbling in neutron tars? Must I wonder anew? Yes, I know the dead demand their due. Our ancestors seek their own redemption through us, their only means. My fears pale beside the perversity of incandescent arrogance, the mind loosed from all constraint. Bodies melt before the throne of abstractions, where Eros is barred, where kind words and promises made veil evil pride. I hear your call, beloved of my soul. Orpheus sinks to meet your embrace, for redemption's sake, mine and yours. So with that poem, I was ready to go. And what I'd like to do is just read a few excerpts and then take a few questions. My relation to the bomb as image begins with my birth in 1950 in Richland, Washington, home of the Richland High School Bombers, where cheerleaders still wear the logo of a mushroom cloud across their chests. There I grew up among my friends and their parents, workers at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, the birthplace of the plutonium bomb later dropped upon the city of Nagasaki, Japan, an incendiary device that killed 70,000 human beings. It never occurred to any of us that by virtue of living in this stark desert land by the mighty Columbia River, we were becoming downwinders, passive recipients of massive radiation leaks from the Hanford Reservation. My dance around the bomb continued through the age of air raid drills. Get back under that desk, young man. And bomb shelters. Mom, will we let our neighbors in or not? Later, while attending a boarding school outside of Washington, D.C., I had a dream in which a huge B-52 was flying over the Capitol. In the dream, bomb bay doors open, and a man who is partly me straddles a bomb as it falls to earth. Some of you may recognize the movie I must have seen just then. It lands near my dorm. There is a huge flash of light, and I can see the veins behind my eyelids. I wake up in a panic, knowing I have but 30 seconds to live. Sure enough, there's a huge boom that rattles the windows and sills and walls. But survival is a powerful instinct. I jump out of bed and dash for the closet to grab some clothes and head for the basement, expecting at any moment to be annihilated. Frantically, I dig in my closet as my mind begins to split and separate the phenomenal world from the dream world. When the process is complete, I'm left standing in my underwear, clothes a jumble, listening to the sharp rain of a thunderstorm clatter against the window. Circumambulating the bomb as image continued when in 1981, PhD in hand, I prepared to have a cross-cultural experience in Hiroshima, Japan, home of the Hiroshima International School where I had secured a teaching position. A month before I was to leave, I had a dream in which I was one of four people in white coats, working skillfully but feverishly around a table. Lying like an anesthetized patient on the table is a cylindrical bomb. Its innards exposed, wires sticking out, waiting to explode. To defuse this device requires a great deal of controlled passion. The fate of the world rests on our shoulders, and sweat pours down our foreheads as we try to keep our hands steady. 5, 4, we almost have it, we're going to make it. 3, 2, wait, just another few seconds. 1, kaboom. In disbelief at my failure, in anger at not having enough time, I am subjected to the full experience of nuclear annihilation. First, the flash of light that lifts and peels the skin, then the explosion that expands and shatters the body, the last sensation that memory can sustain. So this was the dream that I held in my mind as I first orbited around Ground Zero near the Hondori of downtown Hiroshima. It was as if that place, 600 meters above a hospital door, were an aperture from one world into another. But from what kind of world? Would I ever understand what passed through that door? Would I be required to pass through it myself? Later that day, my friend took me to Peace Park. So this is it, I thought, in ego-based wonder. And what is that pretty green mound over there, the one with incense trays before it? Oh, that's the memorial mound for the unknown dead. Inside it are tens of thousands of boxes of human remains, most of them unidentified, waiting to be claimed by relatives. To my surprise, I felt hot tears well up spontaneously in my eyes. An unseen hand gripped my chest and squeezed without mercy, as sobs rumbled clumsily from my chest. I bent my head, half in acknowledgement to the dead, half in shame for my lack of control. And it was only then, with the first awakening to the well of grief, the first time I ever recall crying in public, that I began my descent into the soul of Hiroshima. So that was my first week in Hiroshima, sort of coming to terms with that and walking around feeling very American, very sort of aware of myself as being other in this place. And I was trying to think, well, you know, what can I do? I want to do something. This is the early 80s, you may recall, was a time, you know, Day One was out, you know, there was movies everywhere. You could see your own city with a little bullseye, you know, anybody within this circle is dead, anybody within this circle is going to die within X number of weeks. You know, that kind of imagination was really up in the population at that time. And there I was in Hiroshima, and, you know, what could I do? So I didn't consider myself really a very political person. I was busy teaching, I had a class of 5th through 8th graders at the international school, and I finally hit upon an idea. I thought to myself, well, one of the things I studied in graduate school were dreams, very interested in dreams and Jungian psychology, and I thought maybe I could find and study the dreams of A-bomb survivors. That way, I could see what the underground effect of the experience of being exposed to the nuclear explosion, you know, how the psyche had basically sort of cultivated that image, that experience. If I could see the dreams, then I could maybe find something new that somebody hadn't seen before. So my only job was to go find some hibakusha, some A-bomb survivors, who would be willing to tell me their dreams. But what I discovered was, in the folk ways of Japan, that remembering your dreams is actually a sign of ill health. So for somebody to tell me their dreams, they have to admit they're not feeling very well, except for if you dream actually around New Year's, then that's a whole other thing having to do with divination and stuff. But just in regular life, if you remember your dreams, it means you got some issues. So it was hard to find anybody to tell me their dreams until I did find an A-bomb survivor who was working at the Peace Museum there, and she said, oh yes, I'll tell you my dream. And so here's her dream. In her somewhat breathless and matter-of-fact way, her English accented and delightful, Tomoko offered me this dream story. Ah, Randy-san, I will tell you this dream. You see, many years ago, I went to America to talk of peace. And every night I had this dream, sometimes 2, 3 times a night. I couldn't get any sleep. We traveled all around the country, giving talks, and I was very tired. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I came back home. I didn't leave again for 20 years because of this dream. You see, in this dream, I was 12 years old again, and I woke up on a fine morning. I was walking to school when this big bomb exploded all around me. I was screaming and my dress was on fire, as was the land all around me. People were yelling and running every which way. I tried to make it to this bridge that would lead me back home. As I crawled over the bridge, I heard my name being called. Tomoko, Tomoko. I looked into the water where all these bodies were floating, and there I saw my friend Akiko. She was still alive, slowly turning in the current. Save me, Tomoko, save me. Ah, but Randy-san, you see, I was too weak to do anything. I couldn't save her. I turned away and walked on, and then I wake up feeling terrible. This dream kept happening to me over and over, and I couldn't get any sleep. Listening to this dream, I felt a familiar chill that alerts me to the presence of forces larger than myself. Yet even while I was full of the grief of the dream, I thought to myself that finally I had the dream of hibakusha with which to work. And then Tomoko turned to me, her eyes burning in her lovely, flawed face. She whispered in a low voice full of memory and pain. You see, Randy-san, that's what really happened to me. I dream about what actually happened. I cannot escape. I wish I could have saved my friend Akiko, but you see, I was too weak and was barely able to help myself. I never saw her again. Of all the reactions that one could have to such a powerful story, I was surprised to feel shame begin to spread like a crimson tide over my torso until it reached my smooth and inexperienced face. A voice demanded to know who I thought I was, asking people to tell me their most personal inner experiences. No wonder people would not speak to me about their dreams. The secrets of the Bama's image cannot be penetrated so easily, especially by one who is just awakening to the full extent of the suffering of Hiroshima. Clearly there was a region in the collective psyche of this city that relived the apocalypse on a nightly basis in all its particularities 35 years later. Did I really understand how post-traumatic stress syndrome creates a purgatory of repetitious psychic events? Could I understand the magnitude of the suffering? And what about all the nuclear nightmares I had heard from non-Japanese people? Doesn't the experience of apocalyptic terror that is revealed to us in a dream make symbolic hibakshas of us all? Could it be that the terror is the wake-up call? The terror is the wake-up call, the revelation itself. Could it be that this is the meaning of apocalypse in its original sense, to reveal? And finally, begrudgingly, how many more lessons in pride awaited me before I could claim any wisdom at all? So this is what I mean about scale. You know, it's just like you start dropping down into these deeper and deeper levels, and this scale just gets bigger and bigger. Something I couldn't possibly have imagined if somebody just told me right off. You know, you have to sort of sink down into it. Now, this notion of revelation turns out to be a key understanding for me. The way I think about it is this, that in the future, it would not surprise me if a calendar were recalibrated so that year 1 was 1945, because that was the year in which this new thing came into the world. I talk about it coming through that hole 600 meters above the hospital above Hiroshima, where a bomb was detonated. And interestingly enough, the feast day in the Christian church is the Transfiguration of Christ, August 6th. And what I think, the way that I think about it, remember, this is an imagination of things, and imagination is what's in short supply around these kinds of matters. That's why people tend to just stay at the political level. But if you use your imagination, you can see that something entered into human history that had never been seen before. And it created a sense of fear that is so strong that we can't sort of talk about it very well. And the effect of this fear has been to sort of constrict the soul in a way that it doesn't move very easily. A direct consequence of this is that the imagination isn't given much value, especially in American culture. Look, what's the first thing to get cut in school budgets? You know, the arts program. You know, when in fact it's the cultivation of imagination that's actually a solution to the problem that I'm describing. This concretion, this shutting down of the soul. So that's one thing that enters in. And then the other thing that happens in 1945 with the explosion of the bomb is, for the first time, human beings are able to conceive the idea that whether we have children or not, we're all parents of future generations. Because it's with the advent of atomic bombs that we, human beings, have the human choice to decide whether future generations will exist or not. You see what I'm saying? Now that idea couldn't have been imagined before, because while you can understand genocide and you can understand, you know, wars killing really a lot of people, nobody thought about war killing everyone. So for the first time, people are able to imagine the extinction of the species. Now when you start thinking along those lines, then it now becomes a responsibility of human beings simply to not push the button. So that's our work, is to not push the button so that future generations can exist. Now that's an idea that tends to sink down into the unconscious, and it begins to kick up imagery down there. So one of the things that I've continued doing for the last 15, 20 years is I study the dreams of people, and I'm particularly interested in dreams that have nuclear imagery in it, and notice several things that happen in those dreams. One of the first things that happens is that a recurring motif, if you will, in dreams, is that a bomb will sort of land sort of on the other side of the hill, and you know, like the dream that I had in high school, you know you have about 30 seconds left. So the big question is, what are you going to do with your 30 seconds? Okay? And this is often very similar to psychology, to what people go through when they're given a terminal prognosis. The real question is, what are you going to do with the rest of the time you got? Okay? And what consistently happens in dreams, in which the situation is set up, is that the people who are around tend to move towards each other, and they'll get in these circles, and they'll put their arms around each other like this, sometimes complete strangers, and they'll put their arms around each other, and they'll move in close like this, and they'll put their heads down and wait to be annihilated. Now if you look at that as a symbol, you can begin to see perhaps what the virtue is of the birth of the nuclear age. Namely, it's going to require us to get together in ways that we haven't really thought about before. Okay. And I described this in one section, paragraph, that I talk about this idea that we're all parents of future generations. And I say that moment in which I had this insight was like an egg cracking open on my head. The idea that we are all parents of future generations has slowly worked its way into everything that I think and do. I see the threat to future generations to be at the psychic root of many of our cultural ills: the neglect of children and the aged, the absence of spiritual rites of passage for our adolescents, the culture of narcissism that mocks our democratic institutions, and much more. The psyche, this area in which these dreams are taking place, the deep imagination, true to its nature, is throwing up healing counter-images to this threat, searching and probing for humanly attainable solutions. I believe the revival of indigenous spiritual traditions, with their strong ties to the earth and ancestors, to be a key psychic response to the threat to future generations. Right? The ancestors are going to be really interested in the future. Right, so the ancestors are going to start appearing both in these indigenous spiritual traditions that are trying to remind us of the ancestors, and in people's dreams. I'm telling you, even in the 25 years that I've been working with dreams, I can see a greater frequency of ancestral imagery coming out. I believe the current political debates on multiculturalism are psychically based in a desire for our own ethnic stories to be told and heard. You see how that fascination with your own ethnic history is actually a cultivation of ancestral energies? Doing so resurrects the imagination of our ancestors and links us through them to generations yet unborn. Cultivating the image of future generations in its profundity is a conscious act with moral consequences. To see oneself as a link, as a choice maker in the continuity of generations, is to invest one's choice with mana, or spiritual power, a power grounded in the love of life itself. So I don't consider the threat something necessarily that we have to sort of get all bummed out and just, you know, hold our heads down low. The question is, what is the threat? What new forms of courage and imagination is the threat calling forth from us? You see, it's a much more hopeful way of looking at it. Now, so what I did in Hiroshima, very briefly, and then I'll wrap up here, and take questions if you'd like. But I did do this thing called the Dream Peace Project, where I met at a place called the World Friendship Center in Hiroshima. And we met for a period of a year and a half or so, and we shared dreams, and then I collected these dreams, and one of my essays in this book is about the Dream Peace Project and what came of that work. Then we also started, as a result of those dreams, we started a thing called the Peace Picnic for Future Generations, which I thought was a pretty cool idea, in Hiroshima. And we start down there at the Peace Park, and then we march up to Mount Futabayama, which is an ancient graveyard in Hiroshima. And the idea was to have a non-political rally. And so it was just a potluck. We had some games, and we just did it to honor the future generations. And actually I understand that now it's called the Piasu Lavu Picnic, and it's still going on in Hiroshima. The city took it over. Peace and love. So that was another thing. And then my work since then is contained in the last article in my book, which is called Education for Apocalypse, a Depth Psychological Approach. Because if it's true that some new thing is coming into the world as a result of the atomic explosion, the discovery of the atomic bomb, the flashes creating a kind of doorway from some other place into this place. The word apocalypse means to reveal. You know, there's some kind of veil between realities, so in an apocalypse that veil is lifted and something new comes in. That's the original meaning of the word apocalypse. I do consider it a very spiritual moment in our history. And so the question is, if this is the beginning of something new, some new myth that might be able to both allow us to maintain our own spiritual traditions, but also have this way of linking the spiritual traditions in some new way, then how do we need to educate people in order to receive this new myth? And so my article, Education for Apocalypse, is about that. And while there are traditional modes of education that I talk about, including making sure that you understand the history of Western ideas that have led us to this particular place, especially the history and philosophy of science. You got to know what happened in the Renaissance and the big fight between alchemy and science in the 16th and 17th centuries if you really want to understand what's going on now, and how one won out and one didn't. And so you need to know your Western cultural history. I'm not telling you have to do this, I'm just telling you what's in the article, okay? And I talk a lot about literature. That a very interesting thing about literature is that studies have shown that the ability to predict human behavior is linked to the study of only one discipline. And you would think it would be psychology, right? Study psychology and you can better predict human behavior? No, literature. The more literature you read, the better you are at predicting human behavior. Why? Because psychology just talks about behavior, but literature actually describes it. It describes the motivations, the inner working processes. So the study of literature is really crucial to understanding the nature of other human beings. So I talk in sort of traditional ways, but some of the non-traditional things that I talk about as being really important are a really good, thorough understanding of the body, in particular the way that energy systems work in the body, absolutely crucial for understanding the difference between thinking intellectually and thinking with the heart. So the heart chakra is really a big thing right now, and I think that's another movement from the unconscious to give us the resources we need to respond to these threats. Understanding dreams, I think, is absolutely crucial because it gives you a language for understanding different kinds of psychic phenomena. And I talk about a few others, but those are the ones I wanted to mention. So let me conclude with one last image, and then Bill can say a few words and we'll take some questions. Kind of a favorite story of mine, actually. In Hiroshima, it was my last couple months in Hiroshima. I went up to Kyoto to the International Transpersonal Conference there, and while I was walking through the grass there, I saw this incredible storyteller. He was a huge South African man, Vusamazulu Credo Mutwa. And Credo Mutwa was visiting from South Africa, from Soweto, and he was one of the featured speakers. I didn't know that at the time. But he was this incredible storyteller, and these stories of Africa, just incredible. He had this beautiful sort of English accent where he would discuss the lion and the large mouth of the lion with these dripping teeth, and he could just like, you're just like right there with this guy. Anyway, he was great, so I followed him wherever he went because I sort of wanted to be and see what he was talking about. He gave his address, and then at the end of the conference I was approached by some people asking if I would take Credo down to the Peace Park because they knew that I had lived there and knew the Peace Park really well. I thought, whoa, this is great. So I got on the Shinkansen, the bullet train, with Credo Mutwa, his wife, and 2 other people from South Africa, and took him on a tour through the Peace Park. And an event happened there that is an image that I would like to leave you with, actually. But I have to describe a little bit more about Credo. So he's about 300 pounds, and he has glasses that are about this thick, like the bottom of Coke bottles. You know? And he's wearing an African dashiki, and around his head is a headband that was given to his father by Mahatma Gandhi when Gandhi was working in South Africa, you remember, early in Gandhi's career. And he has on his shoulder this huge brass yoke, and it's very heavy. Apparently everything that he owned had been burned up except this yoke, and he was wearing it on the train for this visit to Peace Park. And the yoke has this wooden mask of Mother Moon and a wooden mask of Father Sun, and then this brass chain that connects it to a Coptic cross at the bottom right over his navel. He says this Coptic cross is the child of Mother Moon and Father Sun. And then hanging right in the middle of his chest is a huge green stone, the exact size of and shape of a human heart. It's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. I actually brought a picture of him, my only picture that I have with me. So all in all, clearly the most spiritual person I had ever been near. And I was sitting next to him on the Shinkansen and we were chatting. I have to tell you, it was that kind of very exciting for me. Anyway, so we go down to the Peace Park and oh, dare I tell this joke? And sure, why not? So we're looking at the big peace bell down there, and Credo's pointing out that the center of the world, there's this big map of the world, and in the center of it, of this map, is Africa. And he's saying, oh yes, Africa. He says, you know, in Africa, to be the king of Africa, you know, now this is Africa, okay, so it's slightly sexist, but if you'll excuse that and get into the spirit of it. He says, you know, to be the king in Africa, you know, you have to sleep with 5 women a night for a whole week, you know, and they have to be happy when they leave. He says, you know, Reagan and Gorbachev, they're just old men, they can't even get it up. That was sort of his, and you know, when you start thinking about that, you know, the image of generativity, there's a lot of wisdom behind it. Anyway, so Credo was that kind of guy. So we're coming now to the cenotaph, and the cenotaph is the most sacred part in the park. It's a huge concrete thing. It's about maybe 12 feet high, and there's a box in the center of it, in front of which is this eternal flame that's always burning. And this box that's in the center contains all the names of the people who have died from A-bomb disease. And every year they put new names in it because every year people continue to die, even today. And one of the articles in Learning to Glow describes an American who was witnessed something I never witnessed while I was there. Namely, once a year they get a crane and they lift the top off of this box and they set it, the Japanese do everything very ritually, they set it very carefully on this white cloth, and then these people with these white gloves go in and they start lifting out these books. I never knew what was in there actually till I read this just the other day. And the books are regular 8.5 by 11, they're about 2.5, 3 inches thick, and every one of them contains thousands of names of people who have died. And the article in Learning to Glow describes one book coming out, you know, 2 books coming out, and the writer's describing each time a book comes out, you know, we're talking about thousands and thousands of names, and his heart just kind of sinks, you know. And it gets to like 10 books, and he doesn't think he can stand anymore, you know. And he turns away, and then he looks back, and oh, another one's coming out, you know. Guys, how many more are there in there? You know, and finally they get to 16 books, and he just can't stand it. It looks like they've stopped anyway, and he just can't stand the emotion, so he walks away. Goes to the Peace Park and asks one of the directors, how many books are there in there? And the peace person says 48. There's 48 books in there. That was just the first layer that he was looking at. Remember that notion of scale? It's always a sort of a scale kind of thing around these issues. So we come to the cenotaph. I'm standing next to Credo. He's carrying this big walking staff with this huge brass eagle on the top of it. And here's our experience. But even as this walk drew to a close, I was not, nor could I ever be, prepared for the single most illuminating moment during my 3 years at the International City of Peace. The small group I was leading paused near the entrance to the Peace Museum. Stretching before us was a pathway, stepping stones to the cenotaph memorial upon which is written, "Rest in peace, for we will not repeat the sin." Each year on August 6th, more names of those who have died from the effects of A-bomb disease are added to the stone box tucked beneath the canopy, eternal flame burning brightly nearby. I explained to my small band of guests that this is the most sacred spot in the entire park. I added a few more words in a quiet voice as we prepared ourselves emotionally for our encounter with the cenotaph. But then I heard a loud tapping noise and noticed that Credo had turned from our group and was walking slowly and deliberately towards the memorial cenotaph. The tapping came from the large black walking staff with a huge brass eagle attached to the top that Credo carried in his right hand. In the sound of the walking stick against the stones, we could hear the sound of anger and pain, of power and determination as Credo walked towards this monument of warning, remembrance, and death. From the other side of the doorway that lies suspended 600 meters above the hospital doorway, a force descended upon our group and enveloped the unfolding scene. Like an electrical field, spiritual energy constellated about us, and the moment slowed to a liquid crawl. Credo reached the stone steps before the cenotaph. I silently groaned as he crashed to his knees. 2 pigeons on the cenotaph roof, their still images vibrating from the heat waves of the eternal flame, etched themselves into my memory. The air was thick and undulating. I saw Credo bend over in prayer, his huge back curved like the wooden statues of the weeping Buddha. After some time, who knows how long, I saw him remove his African headband, that family heirloom linking him to Gandhi's truth force, and lay it gently, lovingly into the ashes of the altar. Then he struggled laboriously to his feet. Slowly he turned to face us, and even from a distance I could see that his eye sockets were full of white, his pupils turned into his head, lost on the other side of Hiroshima's door. Involuntary tears welled into my eyes, and the now familiar hand squeezed my chest yet again. Oh, the suffering! I could feel its immensity coursing through the solitary body of Vusamazulu Credo Mutwa. Louder now, his walking stick crashing against the stones, threatening to split open the earth beneath his feet, Credo walked towards us wrapped in mystical fire. He began to speak, and I strained to hear his words. Unmistakably, he said to me, to us all, "I must take responsibility for what has happened here. I must take responsibility for what has happened here." These words, like an arrow cloaked in mystery, pierced my heart deeply, and there they lie festering today. How can a black South African accept responsibility for a bomb dropped by Americans on the Japanese? What kind of a man is it who accepts such responsibility? What is responsibility if it is something that could be accepted in this way? Kratos' statement challenges my familiar notions of guilt and responsibility, challenges my ideas of God and redemption, and calls me deeper, ever deeper, into the soul of Hiroshima. Thank you.
My piece in Learning to Glow is Mother Witherup's Top Secret Cherry Pie, which was in the book Men at Work, my last book, which is still in print, Asada Press, and there are a number of poems in here about Hanford, my father, and some of these will be reproduced in my forthcoming anthology, New and Selected Poems, Downwind, Downriver. So I'm not going to read my piece, Mother Witherup's Top Secret Cherry Pie. I'm just going to tell you the story. And that is, we moved to Hanford in 1944. My father was one of the first workers to come to Hanford in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was actually born. My father worked at, first of all, it was during the Depression, he worked for a paint company selling paint, DeVoe Paints. And then when the war got into gear, he went to work for Remington Arms, which was a subsidiary of DuPont. And his job at Remington Arms was to check the annealing on cartridges so that they wouldn't jam in the guns. DuPont contracted to build the first nuclear reactor at Hanford. And they put a call for DuPont workers all over the country who were not already drafted or for some reason were not draftable to to come out and work at this new patriotic, secretive industrial facility. And so my father was one of the first ones to enlist to come out to Washington State to work on the bomb. Our family, the three of us, came out in '44. My dad came out in February of '44 and actually worked on B reactor, the very first reactor. And his first job was to log in all the graphite blocks that went into reactor, the B reactor. My mother and middle sister and young brother came out on the train in August of, or in the summer of '44, and so we were there from the get-go, from when they first turned on the first nuclear cooker and started sending out radioactive shit into the environment in all kinds of, in various modes. So it was a very patriotic and very secretive community, and most of our parents worked at Hanford or worked in supporting roles, like Randy's father as a teacher in the high school or in the grade schools, or they were merchants in the town, but everybody lived within this more or less secret society. And I never did know what it was my father, the kind of work he did, because it wasn't talked about around the dinner table. Nor did anyone else. You weren't supposed to talk about your work with your wife or girlfriend or boyfriend or with your children, because if they got word that you were talking about your work, you were out of there in no time. They'd ship you out. So I never did what my father did, except I went to work almost every day on the Grey Goose, which was the bus that went out to Hanford, and I eventually found out what he did. He worked in the manufacturing process, which produced the plutonium that was used in nuclear weapons and in the Fat Man that was dropped on Nagasaki. And anyway, that's my background. So I I was 10 years old when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and we all thought it was great. You know, Richland helped defeat the Japanese, and of course the Japanese were demonized, and all the propaganda, you know, you had all these pictures of buck-toothed Japanese, you know, with their extremely slanted eyes, bayoneting babies and things, and so we grew up with those images. My piece in Learning to Glow, Mother with a Top Secret Cherry Pie, my mother was a great maker of desserts. She cooked the most delicious desserts, and of course to get dessert you had to clean your plate and eat your vegetables and your liver or whatever. And that was your reward for eating all your dinner. If you didn't eat your dinner, you didn't get dessert. So it was always the bait to finish our dessert. Well, during the early years of Hanford, by that time we were a family of 6. My youngest sister was born in Richland in 1945, and so my mother decided to cater some desserts for a little bit of extra money for the family. So she started baking her cherry pies and her cakes and cookies, and she decided that she would advertise them in the Village Voice, which was the precursor to the Tri-City Herald. And unbeknownst to her, Hanford workers were not to advertise in any fashion because the Russians might somehow figure out what we were up to by tracing the productions of a wife or a mother and her cookies to anyway, they somehow might find out how that is what the workers are doing at Hanford. So a man from military intelligence came around one day. My mother told me this story later on, and I describe it in the situation in the story. And a man from military intelligence came around. They were always coming around every 6 months, and they would knock on your door. We were in a duplex, an A-house duplex, and they would ask, you know, about your neighbors, you know, are they politically and morally stainless? You know, that sort of thing. No commie pinkos there. And they do the same thing for us. So that one day, military intelligence came around and knocked on my mother's door, and Dad was at work. He worked shift work. And he had seen her advertisement in the Villager, and he came by to sample a piece of her cherry pie. She says it was actually cherry cake, but I call it cherry pie in the story. And then after sampling, he told her that she was not allowed to advertise in the papers because they didn't want to know didn't want the Russians to know what we were doing at Hanford. You know, I mean, that's how bizarre growing up in a secret nuclear society is. So I extrapolate and play around with that creatively in my piece in the anthology. This is a very good very good anthology, even though I helped put it together. I'll say that. And it's varied. We have so many varied essays, and I think that if you buy a copy, you will really enjoy it. It's a really good read because there are a lot of really good stories in here, and so I encourage you to buy your own copy. And so I won't. I'll just kind of read the table of contents for you. The forward, of course, by well, the forward is by Allison Hawthorne Deming. Introduction by John Bradley. And then part 1, In the Belly of the Beast. At Play in the Paradise of Bombs by Scott Russell Sanders. White Sands by Ray Gonzalez. Mother Witherup's Top Secret Cherry Pie by yours truly. And a really interesting one in here is A Roller Coaster Ride Through the Nuclear Age by David Seaborg, one of the sons of Glenn Seaborg, who developed plutonium. David himself is really quite an eccentric person, like his father was. He's also a poet. He lives in Berkeley, and I met him, and we got his piece in this anthology. Imagine a world without nuclear nightmares. Speaking of nightmares, Randy's imagery, by Mary Laufer. Reciprocal Paranoia, Reflections on the Atomic Era in the Cold War by Phil Woods. Cold Fear and the Real Dr. Strangelove by Craig McGrath. All in the Family by Sonia Huber. And In the Belly of the Beast by Barbara Kingsolver. And so on and so forth. I don't think I'll read the whole table of contents after all. Randy talked about the importance of the imagination and how it's being neglected in contemporary education, and at least in the part of the world that we know, the United States. I don't know about other countries, but in the meanwhile, we emphasize technology in this country, and of course, you know, living in Seattle, how much copy is given to the internet, and Bill Gates and Paul Allen. And as I mentioned on the radio yesterday, there's been more copy given to the internet and the software, and not to point out Bill Gates and Paul Allen necessarily, but more copy given to the technology of the internet than in the last 5 years than there has been in, covering the nuclear question. I got started being a writer by a art teacher who came to my high school when I was a senior, and he was also the advisor to the yearbook. He was an amazing man, and he's still my friend, and he's still active and teaching. And so the first high school annual, and you're welcome to look at these, was that we put out, was done in burlap, and it had cutouts and drawings by students. It blew everybody's mind, but it won national prizes. And then the next one, 1954 yearbook, the Columbian, more artwork by students, and the fellow who did this cover went on to be an architect practicing in San Francisco. And then the 55, the construction issue, the fellow who did a lot of the drawings here was a fairly well-known artist, William T. Wiley. And so I got started thinking about the world by an art education teacher. And so for my part, I'm going to close with a few poems in my forthcoming book, and then we'll open it up to questions and any input that you want to put into it yourself. I made up 10 collector's items here, and I was going to order some copies of Men at Work, which is still in print, for this event, but I didn't get around to it. So my first book, my last collected poems, is out of print, and Men at Work is still in print. And my new and selected poems will be a selection from Men at Work, Black Ash, Orange Fire, and poems written since Men at Work. So I have chosen 4 poems, 2 of them in Men at Work, and 2 new ones to close with myself. And if you would, I have 10 sets here. If you would like to make a donation, you know, $1 or $2, that would be fine. So, spent the afternoon. The folders didn't cost much, but. My father was a very kind man, very sweet man, and you know, later in my life, I had to come to terms with the fact that, you know, he helped work on the atomic bombs. Well, then, my senior year in high school, I helped build one of those nuclear reactors anyway, between the senior summer. So in 1984, he discovered, he retired from N reactor in 1979 after about 30 years working at Hanford, and took an early retirement so some of the younger fellows could stay on because they were cutting down. And he discovered that he had prostate cancer. And my friend and colleague Rick Nelson, who's a counselor and a biologist, says the prostate gland is one of the glands that gathers radionuclides. They don't tell you about that when they're talking about, you know, the increase in prostate cancer. The prostate gland, like the thyroid, is very sensitive to radionuclides. My father dying, 1984. He hums with prostate cancer. Carried plutonium home in his underwear. Ashes of Trinity, ashes of Nagasaki. For Christ's sake, Dad, you went to work daily, out of love and duty, but did the devil's job. You guys stoked hell's ovens, brought home shadows in your lunchboxes. All the discarded radiation badges did not monitor how much your children love you, or measure 30 years of labor smoldering in your work pants, or count the sperm spitting across centuries, igniting everywhere, karmic fires. I was working in California in a landscape distributing company, which also distributed nasty pesticides. And I came to find out. And my mother called me and then said, if you want to see your father before he dies, best come up. So I jammed in my old Volkswagen, and didn't even have any brakes at the time. And I did a hairy trip all the way up here to Richland, but I got here, and my dad had a hospice. We chose to have hospice, home care, and so this is a poem about his death. And I had to leave to get back to work before he died, but I was there very near the time of his death, and the conversation quoted in the poem were actually notes that I took down at his bedside. My father was a plain-spoken man, but had a great sense of humor, a very dry sense of humor. And Mervyn Clyde Witherup, born July 14, 1910, died May 12, 1988. Nearing the end, father was all bones and pain. The tumor had eaten him down to the rind. Yet little he complained or whined, sulfate of morphine eased him somewhat, and he kept his mind in wit, though talking was difficult. A dry wind off the volcanic desert went through each of his rooms, snuffing out cells, left an alkaloid crust on his tongue. We stood by with sponge on a stick when he was assaulted by thirst and images. Give me your hand, he said, and lead me to the water cooler. I've been up in the sky. I'm very tired. Then, irritated with us, he would ask to be left alone. He would suck a sponge and grab the lifting bar, be off again, brachiating from cloud to cloud. Is there a station nearby? How do we get out of here? You'll have to help me, son. He died on graveyard shift. The train came for him at 3 a.m. And when he ran to catch it, he was out of breath. That's the last poem in Men at Work, by the way. And two from the later manuscript, the ones that, Randy was talking about apocalyptic dreams and images, and this is one of my poems about Nagasaki. Nagasaki Journal, August 9th, 1945. The light coughed, cleared its throat of matter, spat a tarry ball of hot mucus on Homo sapiens sapiens. Buddha wept, then laughed. He spun a water lily, flashing signals throughout the Milky Way and Andromeda that birth and death were temporarily arrested, and that souls simmering in the vaginal petri dishes on planet Earth would have to take a new number and wait in line for another 50 years. And the poem that gives the theme to the new and selected, Downwind, Downriver, it's, this poem is dedicated to Frederick Wayne Nelson, again a colleague, counselor, biologist. And Rick did not exactly grow up in the Dalles because his thyroid stopped at age 8, and he wasn't supposed to live past age 15. But if you ever, those of you who've seen Rick, maybe he comes up to about here on my rib cage, but he's managed to live past his 50s because he's a pretty tough guy. So I dedicated this poem to him. And there's a since I'm a literary person, there's a cute little literary reference to a poem by William Carlos Williams in here. The Pure Products of America Go Crazy. That's a William Carlos Williams poem, so the rest of it's perfectly clear. Downwind, downriver for Frederick Wayne Nelson, downriver. Oh, say, can you breathe by the dawn's early wind what so proudly we made at Hanford Engineering Works? Iodine 131, plutonium, ruthenium. At the dawn's early light, irradiated meadow larks filled a young boy's heart with isotopes of beauty. Particle and wave shimmered over the river stones. What so proudly we hailed, looking for arrowheads after my morning paper route, by the hot Columbia, bike sparkling with flakes of mica, not mica. Roll on, Columbia, Woody. Salmon smolt, stunned as they hit the outflow plumes. At twilight's last gleaming, iodine 131 sifting on sage and thistle, on sweet, newly cut alfalfa. Plutonium in the hog swill, ruthenium in the jackrabbit's eye. The pure products of America go crazy. By the dawn's early light, Hiroshima flickers white hot. Nagasaki fuses with the sun. Particle and wave, what physicists proudly hailed, who used murderous intellect to invent deadly winds. Military and scientific elite, gassing their own workers, soldiers, and children. Downriver, downwind, iodine 131, plutonium, ruthenium. Before we open this to discussion, I would like to give a couple credits, and a person who's not a person who's not in the anthology, but who did a lot of work early on with Hanford Downwinders is Judith Georgie. I would like to give her credit for being one of the first ones to bring the Downwinders to attention. A fellow writer and also a fellow member of the National Writers Union, Paul Leb, did one of the first books on nuclear culture, which came out in 1986. By the way, we have a bibliography in the back of Learning to Glow that might be useful to those, I mean, just some of the books about the nuclear question. And I would also like to give credit to an organization that I've volunteered for since 1990, and that is Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, who've done great things for peace. And two of their members are in the audience here, Martin Fleck and Nancy. So I would just like to give credit there. And now we'll just open it up for questions and chewing the fat or whatever you like to do. You can address questions to either one of us.
Would you mind repeating the questions? From
Oh,
the
okay.
audience?
I'll be the question repeater.
Thanks.
Okay. Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, that auditory demonstration by Hall really got to me this morning, or yesterday when you were talking
Yes.
on the radio, and I guess I'm wondering, I guess they're still building bombs, and where do they build them? I mean, I don't drive by a road and say, you know, bombs built here or something. I mean, are they building them in massive quantities still?
Well, maybe Martin Fleck could answer that. Martin, could you answer that?
No, they're not building new bombs in mass quantities. What they're doing is disarming old bombs, taking the component parts, and creating new and more effective weapons. But not in the kind of mass quantities that we made in the past. And the levels have pretty much leveled off.
Pardon me, I forgot to. The question was, are they building new bombs in mass amounts? That was the question.
And where are they building them?
Can't hear the answer.
You couldn't hear the answer either.
Texas.
In Texas is where they're also dismantling them, but I guess they're reassembling them in Texas. Pantex? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And anybody else have a question?
Thank you.
Yes.
You know, I was really hoping that maybe when you were on the radio yesterday that somebody would have suggested to the fellow from the Cato Institute that probably the next atomic bomb could be delivered by UPS. Not have to worry so much about missile defense.
Yeah, right. He was saying he wishes that on the radio yesterday the pro-nuke person was from the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. and the observation was, well, wish you would have told him that the next bomb could have been delivered by UPS.
You know, Cochran, the cartoonist, he was probably, I don't know if he was your age or not, but he used to he did a cartoon with a paper out there.
Cochran?
Yeah, I think his last name was Buzz Cochran, something like that.
There was Dupus Boomer.
Yeah, right.
But that wasn't Cochran. His name was, his name was, his son was my classmate. It was called Dupus Boomer, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Those are collector's items. If you have any Dupus Boomer cartoons, collections. I have one in the archives at the University of Washington. Yeah. Perhaps some of you have had some experience with, growing up in Hanford or downwind, or something you'd like to share, or ask questions, or yes, Judith.
I have. I'm concerned about the secrecy that is still surrounding it. I mean, this project started during wartime, so naturally there was secrecy, but nowadays the secrecy is almost to everyone's detriment because of all the waste dumps and all of the really contaminated places. I mean, most people don't know where they are, and they aren't marked effectively. And you could move someplace that would put you either downwind or downriver. And and nobody's talking too much about this nasty sea that when it hits the Columbia is going to be.
Yeah. The observation that Judith made, she's worried about the secrecy that's still ongoing, and they don't really let you know where some of these poisonous seeps are actually, you could maybe move downwind or next to one, and the Department of Energy would be the last ones to tell you. So, okay. Maybe we'll switch moderators here.
Yeah, well, the level of secrecy in relation to these matters is completely out of proportion to the situation. So that's how we know that there's an irrational factor at work. It's completely unnecessary. So why is there still secrecy? And here, you know, given my psychological way of explaining kinds of things, it's pretty simple, actually. The kind of imagination that tends to constellate around nuclear issues is the same kind of imagination that constellates around imageries of the sacred. And as we know in churches and elsewhere, that secrecy is one of the key modes of worship towards the great mysteries. And I don't think it's too big a leap to understand this huge gap that's fundamentally irrational between the necessity for secrecy and, you know, what's happening in the nuclear program. It can only be accounted for in certain kinds of unconscious dynamics, and the reason is because these issues, these nuclear issues, have taken on the same aura of the spiritual. Okay, I don't know if you all can follow me on that, but you know, the phenomenology of the bomb, the way in which the bomb appears to us, is the same phenomenology as you see depicting God, like in the Old Testament. White hot heat, you know, huge tornado destruction. You know, the phenomena, the descriptors that we use for the bomb are the same descriptors that we use for God. You know, it can annihilate everything. Things are completely relativized by it. You know, so I think with just a slight addition of imagination, you can see that nuclear stuff is carrying a kind of lost spirituality of our culture. And that, to me, accounts for the level of secrecy, which is a completely irrational level. Did everybody hear the question?
I'm kind of rambling. I don't even know.
Yeah, no, I understand the question. Theologically speaking, what we would say is that with the advent of the nuclear bomb, the powers of God have entered into the human psyche. And so humans now believe that they are as powerful as God. Now, that's not something that people would say on the surface of things, but that's the unconscious dynamic of it. And so you get psychological issues like narcissism, you know, where people think they are gods walking around and that they are the center of the universe. A position that was formerly accorded to a sacred divinity is now being taken on by human beings. And that's leading to, well, problems.
Well, I'm just wondering if not to go on too much, it's not my turn, but Mozart, for instance, was a great composer whose music seems to be divinely inspired, and he was nothing but a human being also. How do you talk about Mozart? Well,
Mozart knew his place. The work that he did was in service to the divine. But that's not what you hear most people doing these days.
No.
That's the difference. See, when the ego thinks it is the divine, that's the problem. It's called inflation. When the ego understands that it's relativized by something larger than itself, then it can have a certain amount of humility. And humility is sort of the indicator when somebody, you know, the lack of humility is an indicator that somebody has taken on these godlike energies.
Do you think the Beatles were the divine?
I think it's quite possible they thought they were. I would say they were.
Which Beatle you're talking to?
Yes, well.
I think, why don't we sort of break up now and just be informal and schmooze around, and those of you who would like to buy books or buy Randy's book, or
I've got handouts.
and Martin Fleck always comes well prepared with handouts from the Washington Position for Social Responsibility. So
Reminding people that we
Thank you very much for coming tonight.
also the